Right, at least. Yeah. Okay, so the game started with Ruy Lopez, a.k.a. Spanish. And the first interesting point in the game was this one. Is Magnus going to play the regular Ruy Lopez, or will he play the unleaded and play the Berlin? He plays both. He decided to play regular Ruy Lopez. And in this position, he decided to not play the Archangel with b5 and bishop c5, which is very common. He played bishop e7, which indicates for the world's top players that they're going to play the Marshal. Although, I mean, Magnus has played passively also. But after castles in this position, you're going to play the Marshal. Now, the reason black plays b5 here is the rook is defending the e-pawn. So now white is actually threatening to take the knight and then take on e5. So now you have to play b5 because before that, black could have taken on e4. And in fact, if black wants to play the open Ruy Lopez, he can play knight takes e4 here. But in this position, I mean, knight takes e4 or b5 and knight takes e4. But he decided to play, regular Ruy Lopez. And people who don't want to play the Marshal play d6 first, but there's no real reason to. If you're going to play d6 and then castle and play like a slow Ruy Lopez, then you could castle and then play d6. So even if you don't play the Marshal, this move order makes more sense to me because the guy thinks you might play the Marshal. So now he's scared. Okay, so c3, d6 is like the main line of the Ruy Lopez. And then c3, d5 is the Marshal, which is very likely what Magnus would have played. And instead, he played, let me get back to this. Instead, he played h3. And now if you try to play the Marshal gambit, it seems like knight c3 is a good move, which is not a possible move in the Marshal because white's pawn's already on c3. Now we're putting pressure all over the center here. So white's probably a little bit better. Okay, so instead, Magnus played knight a5, sacrificing his center pawn and getting the two bishops in return. He immediately attacks the e-pawn. Then he attacks it again. And Magnus is playing instantly every move. This is his prep for this variation. Magnus threatens checkmate. Usually threatening checkmate is good, especially if you're playing me. And the players were playing relatively quickly here. And after bishop d6 attacking the knight, king f1 was played, and he said, you're not really attacking the knight. If you take this, I take with the knight. If you take my knight, I trade queens first, and then I take back. Now king f1 is important in case rook e8 is played. There's never going to be a rook e1 check. The king's just better on f1, checks the e file. Okay, so after bishop d6, king f1, rook fb8 was played, which Magnus seemed more familiar with than Jan did. Possible black has other moves, but Jan started thinking now. And the idea of rook fb8 is obvious to even the most dim-witted individual with an advanced degree in hyperbolic topology, which is you're defending the bishop. So now, if it's black's turn, he could move his queen somewhere, unleashing the latent potential of the bishop and not trade queens. Black would prefer not to trade pieces. Black's down a pawn and has a big lead in development. And the problem with moving the queen now, say e6 or c5, is your bishop is not defended. Now it is defended. So now he can play queen e6 or queen c5. So he traded queens. I was afraid of knight b4. So he played bishop d2, c5. This was played very quickly by Magnus. So this is either the end of Magnus's preparation, or after the slightly surprising knight f3 retreat, this is the end of his preparation. I'm guessing Magnus knew this position, but was not familiar with this move. And the point is, my rook's defending my knight. I don't want my rook tied down. My knight really can't go anywhere of note. Knight f3 is very safe. And now if my c-pawn is attacked, I have options. Bishop takes, knight a3, rook c1. So knight f3 is like a safe move. I don't think Magnus was familiar with that. It's not a move that really goes for an advantage. Okay, Magnus untangled his rooks. Knight c3 was a little bit surprising, letting him play knight b4. Then I was very surprised by rook ec1. He decided, the rook can't go anywhere here. This is a half-open file, so I'll just move this rook. Also, Jan made a bet with his seconds before the game that he wouldn't have to move this rook and still not lose the game. Those guys better pay up. Okay, and of course you remember the famous Spassky-Fischer game where Fischer never moved his rook and he won like 80 moves. So, pretty good. Okay, so black has the 2 bishops, more space, and white has an extra doubled pawn. Now, if you're a gawking rabble, and you are, every move you're like, why isn't he ruining the pawn structure? He did do that, just let him do it later. So now I don't have the 2 bishops, this isn't defended as much, and now I can play knight e4 very easily. And this did happen, but it happened later when there were no pieces left, so it was more likely a draw. It's not a bad move, bishop f3, but it's not like the best move in the history of chess. Okay, knight c6 surprised me a lot. I didn't like that move, the knight e7. And here I thought white just had a nice advantage. White's up a pawn, and black's giving a knight's tour. I mean, white seems like he's improved his position, and black, moved his knight from here to here to here to here to here. All right. And now the engine made him, Jan made a move the engine does not like. The engine doesn't mind if the bishop takes this and I take back, because then this pawn's weak, the bishop and the knight control d4, the bishop and the knight control f4, white's up a pawn. But Jan played bishop f4, which I perfectly understand, because he wants to get rid of black's 2 bishops. But now the trades just lead to a stayed position, which should be a draw. Yeah, I think white has winning chances if there's bishops on the board here. But here white just has weak pawns. And it seemed to me the advantage was going back and forth in this position. Obviously, this pawn is attacked. So he played rook c6. Rook e1 attacking the knight. Knight f5, c3. Now Magnus had a big think. And he could play g5, which probably leads to a draw. He could play king f8. Played knight h4, engine approved, attacking the pawn. One of the engines wanted to play rook d1 and give this pawn up, move the rook, and then try to push this pawn. But he played the human move, defending his 2 weak pawns. And now Magnus made a slight inaccuracy, which gave away any good position he had. Should have played g6, which is sort of hard to understand. This knight on this pawn forces the rook to defend it. So white wants to trade knights. Then the rook can wreak havoc, and king e2 can be played, and so forth. So white wants to play knight g2, which I guess Magnus wasn't concerned with. If Magnus was concerned with it, he could have played g6, which gives him luft for his king, and it prevents knight g2, because if knight g2, knight f5, the knight is pre-defended, sort of like Bronwyn's in pre-med, or pre-law.
Pre-law.
Pre-law, yeah. And now, if the rook moves, which is recommended because it's attacked, we lose our d3 pawn, and the engine says black's already winning. Okay, so g6 would make knight g2 not palatable. Black's king can move up the board, and white doesn't really have anything like tough to do. The engine slightly prefers black. Instead, Magnus literally didn't care about knight g2 and played king f8, and now white's better. And now Magnus went into a big think, and he knows if he trades knights, he's just a pawn down on a rook ending. That's likely a draw, but no winning chances for him. So he played knight f5 attacking the rook. Rook here. Now you can't take the pawn because black didn't play g6 earlier. So black has to deal with that. And so he played g6. So I think white's taking over the game, and the game is still a draw, but I'd rather have white. And here, for reasons I sort of tried to explain during the stream, but I don't perfectly understand, king e2 is just the most obvious move. It defends the pawn. Here comes knight e3. My rook's pretty good. I'm a pawn up. The only reason not to play king e2, and what's funny is, to prove how silly what he played knight here, and then played king e2. Frankly, terrible. The only reason not to play king e2 is because you fear your rook is getting trapped. And if Jan analyzed some variation where his rook's trapped, he's not going to play king e2. He wants to have, square for his rook. So the only way to attack the rook is f6, which you should never play. And I guess the rook has to go to e4 because there's no other square. And there's not really a good way to attack the rook. The only way that you can attack the rook right now is knight d6. And then I could play here, which is repetition, or I could play here or here, which is not. I'm not going to lose my rook, but maybe he thought he might lose his rook. He's not an engine. He might say, well, rook on f4 and h4 is dicey. The engine says, no, it's not. That's fine. But he's not an engine, so if his rook does get trapped, he looks very silly. Now, as you all know, in the European Team Championship, which concluded last week, there was a game where White did get his rook trapped in the center, unless it was black. I actually forgot what color it was. And I think it was a 2 rook and knight endgame. And then the guy was like a pawn up, and then he got his rook trapped and resigned. And then everybody made fun of him. So I'm sure the players know that game too. It happened like a week ago. Guys were GMs, like good GMs, better than me, but still lost his rook. Got his rook trapped. Truth hurts. Okay, so he played knight e1, defending his d-pawn instead of the engine recommended king e2. Now his rook will never get trapped because he has e2. But obviously the knight on e1 is a bit passive. A bit. So yeah, thanks Dirk Gently. Yeah. That's actually funny if you say it differently. Okay, so knight g7 is an excellent move. The knight wants to go to f4. And obviously there's a couple ways to do that. Knight's great on f4. Okay, so he said, no, you're not going to play knight f4. And they called the arbiter, and the arbiter said, no talking. f5, he's like, no, I am going to play knight f4. Now, the problem with g6 and f5, if it is a problem, I'm not saying it is this rook can no longer attack these pawns. There's no rook f6 here. There's no rook h6 here. So these pawns are less weak than they were when potentially the rook could have tried to get them later. And after f5, he's not controlling f4 anymore with the rook on e4. So Magnus, always sack the exchange. So Magnus wants to play knight f4. And Jan, who learned German before the match, because he has some German seconds, said, "Ich don't think so," and played knight g2. The engine actually doesn't like knight g2, but he just says, you can't go there, you can't go there, you can't do Vishwa nothing. Psychological ploy, because he's played Vichy twice for the World Championship. Okay. Yay, go hype train. The more level 5 we get to, the better my analysis. Okay, so punishing the passive play by White, he played the move b4. If the c3 pawn ever moves by going here or here, we have a very nice knight d4. And obviously, this pawn structure is not good. Rook here's coming, knight here's coming, knight here's coming. Terrible. Okay, and the other idea behind b4 is to take on c3 and go win this b pawn, which happened. Okay, so b4, please let me go here, and please let me take all your pawns. And he said, please. Remember that, kids. The power of please. Family Guy, Star Wars, Stewie. Okay, so he played king e2, which is excellent, giving his pawn back, but in turn, fixing his pawn structure, ruining his opponents, and getting his king into the game so it's doing something. Rook b8 wins a pawn, so he won the pawn. And now, in this position, knight d4 check looks ominous. You can't take it because you take back with check, attacking the rook. But Jan literally didn't care, and he was more worried about knight g5 in case his rook moves away. He doesn't want both of his pawns attacked, so he played h4. Turns out knight d4 check, which wins if White mistakenly takes it, is in check here and the rook. White just plays king d1, and the engine says, I guess I'm going to go back because the knight's attacked, and there's no way to do anything good. Now, he could have tried to take advantage of this trick by playing the move a5 or rook c b6 and try to merge threats. So after a5, for example, which Magnus probably didn't see. That's my guess. If I take the pawn, double question mark, now knight d4 is winning. Because the rook is not on a1, so after king d1 in the previous position, now we have rook b1 check, which we didn't have with the rook on a1. And in this position, rook b2 check is good, but this move is even better, threatening checkmate. And if you play here, now we're threatening checkmate again, and we're threatening the rook. So black is winning. So after a5, you can't take the pawn, but now black has some winning chances. Rook a6, push the pawn, double rooks and go here and push the pawn. It's still a draw, but a5 is a better winning chance than what he did, which was to have no winning chances. And seeing the move a5 is tough, because you have to see this trick, you have to see that it works, you have to see the rook is needed here, because king d1, so that's, it's a little tough, for a human. So he just moved his king up the board. The rook moved away, stopping knight d4 check. There's no attack of the rook. And here comes my idea. And Magnus, for reasons I don't understand, he's better than me, he was more worried about that. He literally didn't care about knight c4. So he played rook d7, stopping knight d5, which makes knight c4 stronger, because knight e5 is winning. And now the players have reached time control. And for the last few moves, the engine says it's equal. It's equal material. Both sides have a bad pawn structure. This is the only passed pawn, but that's not dangerous. And after rook e7, Jan decided to repeat and draw the game. I thought he might repeat with knight here. Let me get to the right color. I thought he might repeat with knight e3, threatening this, and then this repetition. But Jan, being a better player than me, found a better repetition that was forced. This repetition is not forced. I don't have to play rook d7. I could play rook d6, which again is a repetition. So he just played knight e5. The rook has to stay on this pawn, and then he attacks the rook and so forth. Okay. So only Jan can play for a win here, since that's a forced draw. Problem is, if white doesn't do anything, eventually black can play g5 and get a passed h-pawn. Maybe play h5 first, then g5. Then he's got passed pawns on both sides of the board. These pawns are doubled, and white doesn't have any passed pawns. So I guess in the next 10, 15 moves, Jan was worried black might be better. I don't see a way I can be better, so let's just do the repetition. Which makes sense. The engine says everything is all zeros, repetition or not. But it likes the repetitions. Another repetition is knight a5 to c4. Yeah, this pawn's weak, this pawn's weak, these pawns are all weak. It's equal material. The kings are about the same. Material's the same. Pretty good game. Pretty good. And at the end of the game, this is the final position, the caps thing that tells you how well they played. Mm-hmm. They played better than me.
Yeah.
They played 98.7 for white and 99.1 for black. So the truth hurts. They're better than us. Yeah. And that's because no mistakes were made. No move was made that moved the needle haha, you're winning. Both players were slightly better. Both players used their time immaculately. Okay. It was the immaculate. And I see a press conference now with Maurice in the middle and the players looking bored on each end, hoping the press conference ends soon. They can't wait. And when it does end, Magnus is going to run away as fast as he can. He's going to be like, oh, God, I hate being here. And then Nepomniachtchi will just stand up that's right, I'm the world champion. And he'll walk away very slowly. But yeah, Magnus is going to run, right? And hope that nobody asks him any questions. Yeah, with security.
I'm sure they're tired.
Right, they don't want to talk to, they just played a 4-hour game, 4.5-hour game. They got to prepare for tomorrow. They got to eat, they got to sleep, got to talk to their coaches. They don't want to sit here and talk to the gawking rabble, right? And Hans is there saying, why can't I play? No.
It seems like Maurice is always getting on Magnus's nerves.
Mm-hmm. Delicious. Yeah. Well, thanks for watching. We'll continue with the hype train. We'll try to answer any questions you have right now. We're not going to answer them, but we'll try. I can't promise to try, but we'll try to try. Right?
That's all we can do.
Right. And I guess you can watch the press conference and see which player looks the most perturbed. Right now it's Magnus. Yeah, he's like, leave me alone. I hate doing these. I've done 1,000 of these. Now, the maddest person I've ever seen in a World Championship press conference was Vichy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Vichy was discussing the game, and he gave some 1,000 move variation. And then the Indian reporter said, "Were you looking at that during the game?" And his answer was, "No, I was thinking about what we're going to get for dinner." And he looked really pissed.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Sir Schlemelot gifted a sub. Thank you.
He's usually very gracious, from what I've seen.
Well, he wasn't winning a lot of games against Magnus, and then some. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough right after the game to be nice.
Yeah, right. Just like leave him alone. ZL1 Corvette gifted a sub. Good. Good.
Hey, thank you, ZL1.
Anyway, you could put a marker, for our YouTube person. They could have stopped a long time ago. This is just, I would have already left, but you guys are giving money, so I won't leave that right.